Hello everyone. So today I'm going to create this. So when I click this add person button, we get the input fields for a person. And then when I click this close icon, we can get rid of input fields for a person. And then when I type in some information, name, hobby, and when I submit, the data gets sent back to the same page and get displayed in our table here. So in this video, I want to focus on adding input fields for a person and deleting input fields. And so I'm not going to talk about the backend to send the data back to the same page to display them here, or I also will not talk about the styling or anything like that. All right, so let's jump right into it. Okay, so this is the JavaScript code that we are going to write. So it's just 22 lines of code, so it's really, really short. Okay, so I'm gonna get rid of that. Okay, so let's start writing some JavaScript code. Okay, so what we want to do is, we want to do something when a user clicks add person button. So in our JavaScript, we want to have a reference to that. We want to have a reference to add person button. Okay, so the way we do that is by saying document.querySelector, and then inside the bracket, we say the selector that we want to have a reference to. So we want to have a reference to add person button, and then in our PHP file, we have add person button here, and this element has a class called add-person. So I'm going to use that class name. So dot add-person, and so now we have a reference to add person button. And I'm going to store that into variable, and I'm going to call that variable add person, like so. Cool. And also what we want to do is, so we want to add some input fields to our form. And in our case, we want to add some input fields to this div right here. And it has a class called field-container. So we want to have a reference to this as well. So I'm going to just copy this class name. Okay, so let's create a reference for this field-container as well. So we basically do the same thing. Document query selector, and then specify the selector. So now we have a reference to our form, or the part where we want to add some input fields later. And I'm gonna store that into variable, and I'm gonna call that variable field container. Cool. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is we want to write some code that says when a user clicks add person button, we want to add some input fields to our form. So in order to do that, we are going to use addEventListener. So I'm going to use addEventListener on add person button. addEventListener. And then it takes two parameters. The first parameter is the type of event, and the second parameter is a function that we want to call when that event happens. Okay, so for the first parameter, we want to specify the type of event, in our case, click. And for the second parameter, we want to write a function that we want to call when the click event happens, like so. Okay. So what this code here means is that when the click event fires on add person button, we are going to call this function. Okay, so inside this function, we want to write some code that lets us insert some input fields to our form, right? Okay, so let's write that code. Okay, so let's go back to index.php. So the place where we want to add some input fields is inside of this div, which has class called field-container. Okay. So I'm going to say field container, and in order to insert some HTML inside this div, I'm going to use a method called insertAdjacentHTML. And this method takes two parameters. The first parameter is the position where you want to add HTML, and the second parameter is the HTML that you want to add. Okay. So for the first parameter, there are only 4 types of positions that we can use. Okay, so I'm going to make a list of all the 4 types here. Okay. And I'm going to also explain where HTML will be added when I specify each position. Okay, so the first position we can use is before begin. And if I use before begin, then HTML will be added right before the element on which insertAdjacentHTML method is used on. Okay, so field container, right? So we have field container here. So right before that, so HTML will be added here before begin. Cool. The next position we can use is after begin. So if we use that, then HTML will be added right before the first child of the element on which this method is being used on. So the first child of field-container is this h2, right? So right before that, so HTML will be added here after begin. Okay. The next position we can use is before end, and if we use that, HTML will be added right after the last child of the element the method is being used on. So the last child is also this h2, right? This is the only element that we have inside field-container. So right after that, so HTML will be added, here before end. And the last position we can use is after end. And if we use that position, HTML will be added right after the element. So here, after end. Cool. All right. And the position where we want to add some input fields is here. So I'm going to use before end for the first parameter of insertAdjacentHTML method. So for end. Cool. And for the second parameter, we can write some HTML that we want to add to the position that we have specified right here. Okay. So, and we need to do that in strings form, in the form of strings. So I'm going to just use backtick. So if we use backticks, we can write multi-line strings just by wrapping the entire thing with backticks. Okay, so I'm gonna write HTML that we want to add. So I'm gonna create div, and then I'm gonna call that each person. Okay. And then I wanna create a close button, close icon that the user can hit when the user wants to delete that person's input fields. So I'm gonna say button, and then I'm gonna give it a class of close. And the close icon can be created by saying ampersand and times semicolon. And I'm gonna close the button tag. And so the first input is the name of the person. So I'm gonna create a label and say name and close the tag, and then line break, then input field for the name of the person. So the type is text, and the name of the data is gonna be, let's say, name, because it's the name of the person. And then we could have more than one person. So we want to send the data as an array. And then I'm going to say required, so that user will be required to type in some information before submitting the form. Okay. And I'm going to say line break here as well. And I'm going to create label again. So the second input field is going to be about the hobby of the person. So I'm going to say hobby, and I'm going to close label tag, and then and then I'm going to add line break again, and then I'm going to create the second input field for the hobby of the person. So the type is going to be text again, and then the name of that data is going to be hobby. And then again, we're going to want to send that data as an array. Cool. And then I'm going to say required again. So, and then I'm going to just close the entire thing. Cool. Okay. So I'm going to save the files. And I'm going to refresh the page. Actually, I'm going to empty cache. Okay, let's test it out. So when I click add person, there you go. Now we are able to insert input fields for a person. Great. Cool. Like that. Okay, so the reason why this message, please fill out this field, pops up is because so the browser interprets hitting this button as submitting this form. because by default, if we have a button element inside a form, then this button will be behaving as a submit button. So whenever I click this button, the browser is going to think, okay, this person is trying to submit the form. But we don't want to do that. We don't want to use this button as a submit button. We want to use this button as a submit button. So in order to prevent that default behavior, what we can do is we can say here event.prevent default. So this function can take event as its first parameter. And then if we say event.prevent default, we are able to prevent that default behavior of this button submitting the form. Cool. So if I save that and refresh the page and click this add person button, the message no longer pops up. So that's great. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is to write some code that says, when a user clicks this close icon, let's delete that person's input fields, this entire thing. So first I'm going to show you a bad example. So the first instinct might be to do the same thing, basically. So get a reference to this close icon and then use addEventListener on this close icon, and then inside the addEventListener we can write a function that lets us delete this person's input fields. So I'm going to write the code of that bad example. So to get a reference to the close icon, basically do the same thing, document.querySelector, and the close icon has a class called close, and we're going to use that class name. So now we've got a reference to the close icon, and then store that into a variable called delete person. Okay. And then we can use addEventListener on the close icon. So delete person, addEventListener, and it takes two parameters, right? The first parameter is the type of the event that we want to listen for. So let's click in our case. And the second parameter is the function that we want to call when that event happens. And then inside this function, I can write some code to delete that person's input fields. Okay. So this is not going to work. So the reason why this will not work is because this JavaScript code runs when the page first loads, right? So let's refresh the page. Okay, the page first loads, and when that happens, we do not have anything inside our form. So we do not have this close icon anywhere inside our form. And so that's when this code right here runs, right? So this code is trying to get a reference to an element, HTML element, that has a class called close, right? But at this point, we do not have any close icon. So essentially what we're doing here is this is going to return null, and then we're storing null into variable here. Yeah. So here we are trying to call or use addEventListener on what we think is close icon, but essentially what we're doing here is we are using addEventListener method on null. So that's why this code is not going to work, right? So the solution to this problem is simply by using this addEventListener method on something that does exist when the page first loads. Okay, so what does exist when the page first loads? So if we go back to index.php, so we do have this, right? We do have field-container when the page first loads, because I've written the HTML here. So we can use addEventListener on this div. So let's get rid of this bad example code. Okay, so I'm going to use addEventListener on field container. So it takes two parameters, right? And the first parameter is the type of event. And the second parameter is the function that we want to call when that event happens on this element. Like so. Okay. And then inside this function, I could write some code that deletes that person's input fields. Okay. So this code still does not work. It's not perfect. Because, for example, if a user clicks like here, for example, this is still inside field container, right? Or if I click hobby, this text, this is still inside field container. So this function will still be called and delete that person's input fields. But we don't want that. We want to delete this person's input fields only when a user clicks this close icon, right? So we need to write some code to check if the click event actually happened on this close icon. So the way we do that is by saying target. Okay, so this function that we're going to call in response to the event we specify here can take the event as its first parameter. Okay, so by saying e.target, so this e.target represents the actual element that this click event happens. So what do I mean by that? So let's see. So when the page is like that, essentially, okay, let's copy this code here. Well, actually, let's go back to index.php. So right now, index.php is like this. But if the page is like that, where it has one person's input fields, essentially the code would look like this. So here, like this, right? There is one person's input fields, like that, or like that. So what this e.target represents is the element the click actually happened on. So the click could happen on like here, or like here, this button, or it could happen here, or it could happen here. It could happen basically anywhere inside this field dash container, right? But by saying e.target, this represents the element where the click actually happened. So the click happened on like this text called name, then this will be represented by saying e.target. Okay. So we can write some code to check if the click event actually happened on this close icon. So the way we do that is by checking if this e.target has a class called close, right? If e.target has a class called close, then that means that the click actually happened on this close icon, right? So the code we want to write is class list. So this returns all the class names that this e.target has. And then by saying contains, we can check if this class names list has actually has the class name that we specify here. So this code is checking if the element where the click actually happened has a class called close or not. So if this becomes true, that means that click actually happened on the close icon, right? So then inside this curly brackets, we can write the code to get rid of that person's input fields. Okay. So the code is going to look like this. So essentially, if a user clicks this close icon, we want to get rid of this thing, entire thing. So the code is going to look like this, e.target. So if e.target is this close icon, we want to delete this entire thing. So we want to get the parent of the close icon. So to do that, we can say parent node. So the parent node method returns the parent of the specified node. Okay. And then we want to remove that from our DOM tree. So we can use remove method. Okay, so this should work. Let's save the files. Actually, so this part's what I added just for the purpose of testing. So I'm going to get rid of that. Okay, so this is back to normal. Okay, the files are saved. Refresh the page. And let's add person. And then when I click the close icon, there you go. We are now able to delete that person's input fields. So let's test some, let's write some information here. Hobby, name, hobby, and let's submit. And then there you go. The data get sent back to the same page and get displayed on in our table. Cool.